On a Tuesday morning in the first week of October 2019, a man named Preston Hale backed a Case IH Magnum 380 out of his equipment shed on 480 acres of Iowa farmland outside a town called Milburn and drove it into the east field for the first time. The field was the same field he'd planted in April. The soil was the same soil his father had worked before him and his grandfather before that. The corn rows were the same corn rows. The distance from the equipment shed to the east field's far fence was the same distance it had always been. But the tractor was red. For 22 years, everything in Preston Hale's equipment shed had been green and yellow. 4 machines across that time, 2-row crop tractors, a utility tractor, and a combine, all John Deere, all purchased from Lyndon Hargrove's dealership on County Road F, 31 miles south of Milburn. The same dealership Preston's father had bought from, and the same dealership that his 2 nearest neighbors, Dale Ostrander and Ray Cofield, had been buying from since before Preston had his first driver's license. And now Preston was in a red tractor in his east field for the first time, and the tractor was good, genuinely good, and the field didn't know the difference. But Lyndon Hargrove's dealership was going to know the difference very soon. Because the machine Preston had just replaced, a 2017 John Deere 8R370, had cost $340,000, and it had left Preston's farm in September, loaded onto a dealer trailer, and it was not coming back. And neither was Preston's utility tractor. And the combine was next in the spring, and Preston hadn't told Lyndon Hargrove it was coming. He hadn't called to explain. He hadn't sent a letter or filed a complaint or posted a word anywhere that Lyndon's staff could have found. He had simply stopped. This is the story of why Preston Hale sold a $340,000 John Deere and bought a Case IH. And it is the story of what happened 3 years later when a man drove 4 hours to his farm to ask him the question that Preston had been ready to answer since the day he made the decision. To understand the decision, you have to go back to a Saturday morning in January of 2019, when Preston was sitting at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee and a printed document that his agronomist, a careful woman named Dr. Linda Marsh, had handed him at their annual planning meeting the week before. Dr. Marsh had been working with Preston's operation for 11 years. She built his application maps, analyzed his yield data, calibrated his input rates against his soil variability, and had over that decade helped Preston's corn yields climb from 19.7 bushels per acre to 214, not through magic, through data. Through the precise understanding of what each acre of his ground needed, calibrated annually against what each acre had actually produced. The document Dr. Marsh gave him was a John Deere investor relations filing, not a brochure, not a sales sheet. An investor relations filing, the kind of document a company produces for the people whose money it runs on and whose continued confidence it cannot afford to mislead. Dr. Marsh had said when she handed it to him, "Read page 17 and then read page 23 and then call me." Preston had read it that Saturday morning. He read page 17, which described John Deere's 5-year strategic direction for its precision agriculture platform. And he read page 23, which described the company's intent to transition its equipment data architecture toward a fully integrated proprietary ecosystem by 2022. And then he sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the document on the table in front of him and his coffee going cold beside it. He called Dr. Marsh. She answered on the second ring. He said, "Linda, what does this mean for the yield mapping we've been doing?" She said, "It means that by 2022 every data output from your John Deere equipment, every yield map and every soil reading and every application rate record will pass through John Deere's proprietary platform before it reaches me, and the platform will charge a subscription fee for that access. And the platform will determine what data I can see, in what format, and at what resolution." Preston said, "And right now?" Dr. Marsh said, "Right now I connect directly to your equipment's raw sensor output. No filter, no subscription, no intermediary. I see everything the machine sees, in the same format the machine records it. That's why we've been able to build the application maps we've been building." Preston said, "What happens to the maps if the data goes through their platform?" Dr. Marsh said, "The resolution drops. Not completely, but enough that the variability work we've been doing at the 10-meter scale becomes difficult at the 25-meter scale. Some of the precision we've built into your input rates over 11 years goes away. Not all of it, but some. Preston said, "How much of my yield improvement came from that precision?" There was a pause on Dr. Marsh's end of the call. She said, "Preston, I've been working with you for 11 years. Our best estimate, based on the years when we had high-resolution data versus the years when the equipment had connectivity issues and the data was patchy, is that the precision mapping accounts for somewhere between 8 and 12 bushels per acre of your yield improvement. 8 to 12 bushels per acre on 480 acres of Iowa corn ground. At current prices." Preston did that math quietly while Dr. Marsh waited on the phone. He said, "And the subscription?" She said, "The investor document doesn't give retail pricing, but it describes the model. Annual subscription per machine, tiered access levels, premium data features at premium tiers." Preston said, "So I buy a $340,000 machine and then pay annually to access the data it produces." Dr. Marsh said, "That's what the document describes." Preston said, "And my independent mechanic, Clint borrows." Dr. Marsh said, "Clint's third-party diagnostic tools will lose access to the new software architecture. Same timeline. By 2022 or 2023, a new John Deere will require an authorized dealer technician for any repair that involves the software layer. Which of these machines is most repairs?" Preston knew what Lyndon Hargrove's dealership charged for an authorized technician. He knew it because he had the service invoices in a folder in his office desk. $182 an hour in 2018. He also knew what Clint Barrows charged. $85 an hour. Preston said, "Linda, I need to run some numbers." Dr. Marsh said, "That's why I gave you the document." They hung up. And Preston spent the rest of that Saturday morning at the kitchen table with the legal pad and a calculator, running the numbers the way his father had taught him to run numbers, all the way to the end, without stopping at the place where the numbers got uncomfortable. The numbers reached the end. He set the legal pad down and looked out the kitchen window at the equipment shed where the 8R370 sat in the morning light. $340,000 worth of green and yellow machinery that had been his for 2 years and that he had maintained exclusively through Lyndon Hargrove's dealership every service interval. His wife, Carol, came into the kitchen for coffee. She saw the legal pad and the printed document and Preston's expression, which she had learned in 28 years of marriage to read accurately before he said anything. She said, "How bad?" Preston said, "Not bad yet, getting there faster than I'd like." Carol said, "What does the pad say?" Preston said, "It says that by 2024, if John Deere executes the direction in that document, the combination of platform subscription costs and authorized-only service costs on the new equipment generation will add between $41,000 and $68,000 to my annual operating overhead, depending on which tier of the platform they price at." Carol looked at the pad. She looked at the document. She said, "And Case IH." Preston looked at her. He hadn't mentioned Case IH. She had arrived there herself. He said, "Walt Eggers runs an open platform. Dr. Marsh can connect directly. Clint Barrows can access the full diagnostic system. The subscription model doesn't exist in the same form." Carol said, "Have you talked to Walt?" Preston said, "Not yet. I wanted to run the numbers first." Carol poured her coffee. She looked at the equipment shed through the kitchen window. She said, "Run them again tonight and make sure you haven't missed anything." Preston said, "I haven't." Carol said, "Run them again anyway." He ran them again that evening. The numbers said the same thing. Preston called Walt Eggers at Midwest Case IH in Clarinda on a Monday morning. Walt had been selling and servicing Case IH equipment in the 4-county area around Milburn for. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. 17 years. He was not a man who oversold. He was a man who answered the question he was asked and did not inflate the answer to close a transaction. Preston asked him about the data architecture. Walt answered it completely. Open third-party integration. Full diagnostic access for independent mechanics. No proprietary platform subscription for standard data output. Preston asked about the Magnum 380's performance specifications and compared them against the 8R 370s on the legal pad while Walt was talking. Preston asked about service rates. Walt told him. The rates were not identical to Clint Barrow's, but they were competitive with what Lyndon Hargrove's dealership had charged before the most recent increases. Preston said, "Walt, I'm going to need some time with this before I commit to anything." Walt said, "Take whatever time you need, Preston. This is a significant decision." Preston said, "I appreciate that." He spent February the way he spent most of February, which was in the equipment shed doing maintenance and reading everything he could find about the direction both companies were going. Industry publications, university extension research, an academic paper out of Iowa State that a professor named Dr. Thomas Weller had published on proprietary software architecture in agricultural equipment, which had been read by almost nobody in the farming community because academic papers about proprietary software architecture are not what farmers read in February. Preston read it. It said what the legal pad already said, in the language that university economists use when they want to be precise. Dr. Weller's modeling estimated a cumulative cost differential of between $180,000 and $240,000 over a 10-year equipment ownership period for operations the size of Preston's, comparing closed architecture equipment against open architecture alternatives, assuming the rate trajectories visible in 2018 service data continued. $180,000 to $240,000 over 10 years on one set of equipment. Preston added Dr. Weller's paper to the folder on his desk that already held Dr. Marsh's investor document and the legal pad and the service invoice history from Lyndon Hargrove's dealership. In March, he called Clint Barrows. Clint was 61 years old and had been fixing farm equipment in the Millburn area since he was 19. He ran a one-man shop outside town and had Preston's machines on his service calendar every year. He was not a man who dramatized what he knew. He was a man who said what he saw and let you decide what to do with it. Preston said, "Clint, tell me honestly what you're seeing with the John Deere diagnostic access on the new stuff." Clint said, "You want the honest version or the polite version?" Preston said, "I've been getting the polite version from the dealership for a year. Give me the honest version." Clint said, "The honest version is that on your 8R 370, I can still access maybe 60% of what I could access on your previous machine 2 years ago. The other 40% requires the John Deere diagnostic system that only authorized dealers have the dongle for. And every software update narrows my access a little more. By the time that machine is 3 or 4 years old, I'm going to be useful for maybe filter changes and belt adjustments. Anything involving the electronics or the software, you're calling Lyndon." Preston said, "And Lyndon's rate last year was $182 an hour." Clint said, "And Lyndon knows he's going to be the only option." Preston, "I've been watching this for 3 years. I'm not the only independent in the county who sees it. 3 of my colleagues in the next county over have already started telling their John Deere customers to budget differently, because the rate has no ceiling when the competition is gone." Preston said, "Thank you, Clint." Clint said, "You're thinking about switching." Preston said, "I'm thinking carefully." Clint said, "If you switch, I can still work on Case IH." Preston said, "I know." He hung up and added that conversation to the folder in his desk, not in writing, but in the accounting that he had been running since January and that had by March reached a conclusion as clear as any accounting he had ever completed. If you like the video, please subscribe to our channel. He called Walt Eggers in April and told him he was ready to move. The 8R 370 left in September 2019. Walt Eggers delivered the Magnum 380 personally, which was not standard procedure and which Preston understood to mean that Walt was serious about the relationship in a way that went beyond the transaction. Walt spent 3 hours walking Preston and his son Tyler through the machine, not the sales version of the 3 hours. The complete version covering the data integration setup, the diagnostic access protocols, the service schedule, and the specific operational differences between the Case IH platform and the John Deere system Preston had been running for 22 years. Tyler was 24, had grown up around equipment, and had his father's eye for mechanical detail. He listened to everything Walt said and asked the questions that a young man asks when he is absorbing information he understands he is going to need for a long time. When Walt left, Tyler stood in the equipment shed doorway and looked at the red machine in the bay where the green machine had been. He said, "It's different." Preston said, "Everything you haven't learned yet is different." Tyler said, "What's the same?" Preston said, "The field, the soil, the work." Tyler said, "That's enough?" Preston said, "It's everything." They started learning the machine the way you learn any machine that is new to you, which is by running it carefully through familiar work and letting the operational knowledge build the way it always builds, from hours and attention and the gradual accumulation of understanding that no specification sheet can replace. The first planting season in the spring of 2020 was the proof of concept that Preston had known it would be, not a dramatic revelation, a quiet confirmation. The machine performed. The data integration worked exactly as Walt had described. Dr. Marsh connected to the raw sensor output directly, without a subscription layer, without a proprietary filter, and built the application maps the way she had always built them. The yield maps from the 2020 harvest showed 221 bushels per acre across the 480 acres. Preston's best year in the John Deere equipment had been 214. Not all of it was the equipment. Dr. Marsh was careful to say that. The variability mapping was the same work they'd always done, but without the data compression that the John Deere platform had been introducing incrementally over the previous 2 years. The application rates were more precisely calibrated. 7 bushels per acre of that improvement was attributable, in Dr. Marsh's estimation, to data resolution. 7 bushels per acre on 480 acres. Preston added the yield comparison to the folder in his desk. He told his neighbor Dale Ostrander about it in September of 2020, at the grain elevator in Milburn, when Dale asked him directly why he'd switched. Dale had been buying John Deere from Lyndon Hargrove for 27 years. He asked the question with the specific directness of a man who has been watching something happen at his neighbor's farm and has finally decided he needs to understand it. Preston said, "Come to the farm on Saturday morning, I'll show you the numbers." Dale came. Preston showed him the legal pad from January 2019, the investor document, the academic paper from Iowa State, the yield comparison, and the service cost projections. He set them on the kitchen table in the order that made the case clearest, not the most dramatic order, but the most logical one. Dale read everything. He was not a fast reader. He was a thorough reader, the kind that goes back to the beginning when he isn't sure he's understood something correctly. When he finished, he said, "This is John Deere's own investor filing." Preston said, "Downloaded January 2019. Dale said, "And the yield improvement?" Preston said, 221 last year. 214 was my best year on the John Deere. Dale said, "And your mechanic?" Preston said, "Clint Barrows can still work on the Case IH. Full diagnostic access, same as always." Dale sat with the documents for a while. Then he said, "What does Walt Eggers say about the data integration?" Preston said, "Tell him I sent you." Dale nodded. He went home. He called Walt Eggers the following week. He came back to Preston's farm in December with a question. "If I switch in the spring, will my yield maps from the last 3 years transfer to the Case IH platform?" Preston said, "Ask Dr. Marsh. She built them. They're yours." Dale called Dr. Marsh. The maps transferred. Dale ordered a Case IH Magnum in January 2021. He was the second farmer in Milburn to switch. He was not the last. Preston told the same story to 2 other neighbors in the fall and winter of 2020, when they asked. He told it the way he had told it to Dale, sitting at the kitchen table with the documents in the order that made the case clearest, patient and complete, and without the emotional inflation that turns a legitimate decision into a crusade. He was not running a campaign. He was answering questions. The threshold he had set for himself was simple. If a neighbor asked him directly why he had switched from John Deere to Case IH after 22 years, he was going to answer the question completely and honestly. He was not going to raise it. But if it was asked, the answer was going to include everything. 4 farmers on the Milburn Road switched to Case IH between September 2019 and the spring of 2021. A 5th began the process in the fall of 2021. None of them had been told to switch. All of them had read the legal pad and the investor document and run their own accounting. The accounting said the same thing every time. Not because Preston had built a persuasive case, because the numbers were the numbers. Lyndon Hargrove noticed in his dealership's quarterly review at the end of 2020. He noticed it the way a man notices a pattern in his revenue data after it has been building long enough to be unmistakable. 5 accounts, 4 of them clustered in the Milburn area. The defection timeline starting in September 2019. He pulled his customer records. He looked at the connections between the 5 accounts. He looked at which farms had switched first and which had followed. He traced the pattern the way you trace a pattern when you are a businessman looking at revenue you have lost and trying to understand the route it took out of your territory. The route led to Preston Hale's 480 acres outside Milburn. Lyndon Hargrove's service manager, a man named Greg Atkins who had worked for the dealership for 19 years, told Lyndon in January 2021 what he knew about the Milburn situation. Greg said, Preston Hale ran a cost analysis. I've heard from 2 people who've seen the documents he puts on the kitchen table when someone asks him. Investor relations materials from corporate, academic research, his own yield comparisons. He built a case over about a year before he switched. And when anyone asked him why, he showed them the case. Lyndon said, Is the case accurate? Greg was quiet for a moment. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. He said, Lyndon, our service rate has gone from $147 an hour in 2017 to $194 an hour in 2020, and corporate is projecting another increase for 2022, and the diagnostic access restrictions on the new platform are real. I've been watching the independent mechanics in the county lose access to system functions on every software update for 3 years. Lyndon said, So the case is accurate. Greg said, The case is accurate. Lyndon looked at his quarterly revenue summary. He looked at the 5 accounts and the dollar value of equipment purchasing they represented over a standard 5-year replacement cycle. He thought about Preston Hale. He had known Preston for 12 years. Preston's father had bought from the dealership before Preston took over. He had been a reliable, consistent customer who serviced his equipment on schedule and never missed a payment and never made a complaint he didn't have specific grounds for. Lyndon thought about whether he had ever had a conversation with Preston about the platform changes, whether he had ever explained what the data architecture transition was going to mean for Preston's relationship with his independent mechanic or his agronomist. He had not. He had sold Preston the 8R370 in 2017 with the specific professional emphasis that the machine's precision agriculture capabilities represented the cutting edge of what was available, which they did. He had not mentioned that within 5 years, accessing those capabilities without John Deere's subscription layer was going to become progressively more difficult, not because it was a secret, because it was not the part of the conversation that closed transactions. Lyndon sat with that for a while, and then he made a decision that his territory manager at John Deere had not asked him to make, and that his dealership's standard protocol did not require, and that the 4-hour drive from his dealership to Preston Hale's farm on County Road F made objectively inconvenient. He decided to go. He called his office manager on a Monday morning in March 2022 and told her he would be out of the dealership from early morning until late afternoon on Wednesday. He drove a company vehicle. He left before 6. The drive took him north on the interstate and then onto the county roads that run through the farmland south of Milburn. The roads that in early March carry the particular quality of Iowa ground that is not quite thawed and not quite ready, fields still brown and bare, and fence lines still stripped to their winter bones. Lyndon had been making drives like this for 21 years. Dealer visits, customer calls, equipment deliveries. He knew these roads. He knew most of the farms along them. He had sold equipment to families on 2/3 of the properties he passed. But he had never driven 4 hours to ask a farmer what he already knew the answer to. He arrived at Preston's farm at 10 in the morning. Preston's truck was in the yard. The equipment shed door was open. The red tractor was visible inside. Lyndon parked and got out and stood in the yard for a moment before he walked to the shed. Preston was in the shed when Lyndon reached the doorway. He saw the dealership vehicle in the yard before Lyndon appeared. He had enough time to set down his tool and wipe his hands on a rag and be standing at a reasonable distance from the door when Lyndon came around the corner. Preston said, "Lyndon." Lyndon said, "Preston, I should have called first." Preston said, "I knew you were coming." Lyndon looked at him. "How?" Preston said, "Dale Ostrander told me your service manager had been asking questions. This is a small county, Lyndon." Lyndon absorbed that. He looked at the Case IH in the bay that the John Deere had left in September 2019. He said, "Is that the Magnum 380? Preston said, "380 AFS Connect. Second season. If you like the video, please subscribe to our channel." Lyndon nodded at the machine with the professional assessment of a man who has sold equipment his whole life and cannot stop evaluating it even when he is standing in a competitor's shed. "How is it?" Preston said, "It's a good machine." Lyndon said, "And the data integration?" Preston said, "Dr. Marsh connects directly, no subscription layer, full resolution." Lyndon said, "And Clint Barrows?" Preston said, "Full diagnostic access." Lyndon looked at the machine for another moment. Then he looked at Preston. He said, "I drove 4 hours to ask you something." Preston said, "I know." Lyndon said, "I want to understand what I missed." Preston said, "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table. Carol brought coffee and sat down without being asked, the way a woman sits down when she has been waiting 2.5 years for a conversation to happen. Preston went to his office and came back with the folder. He set it on the table between them and opened it to the investor relations document. He explained the same things he had explained to Dale Ostrander, to Dr. Marsh on the phone in January 2019, to himself on the legal pad that was still in the folder, the original calculations still visible in the handwriting that Carol said looked like his father's. Lyndon read the investor document carefully. He was not a fast reader, and Preston let him take his time. Carol refilled the coffee without being asked. When Lyndon finished reading, he sat for a while and looked at the document. He said, "You had this in January 2019. Preston said, "Dr. Marsh gave it to me." Lyndon said, "And the legal pad?" Preston said, "January 2019 as well." Lyndon looked at the numbers in the third column of the legal pad. He said, "These projections, the service cost differential." Preston said, "Based on the rate trajectory from 2017 to 2019 and the access restriction timeline the document describes." Lyndon said, "And your actual costs since you switched?" Preston took the 2020 and 2021 service invoices from Clint Barrows out of the folder and set them beside the legal pad. Then he took the 2019 and 2020 Lyndon Hargrove service invoices out of the folder and set them beside those. Lyndon looked at all 4 documents without touching them. He said, "Your cost per service hour went down." Preston said, "Not dramatically, but Clint doesn't have a platform subscription to recover, and his rate hasn't moved the way yours has." Lyndon said, "Our rate is set regionally. I don't have control over it." Preston said, "I know that." Lyndon said, "And the yields?" Preston took the yield comparison out of the folder, 2017 through 2018 with the John Deere equipment, 2020 and 2021 with the Case IH. Lyndon read the numbers. He said, 7 bushels per acre. Preston said, "Dr. Marsh attributes most of that to data resolution. The application maps are more precise without the platform filter." Lyndon looked at Carol. Carol was looking at him with the specific regard of a woman who has been waiting for someone to sit at her kitchen table and reckon with something for 2.5 years. Lyndon said, "I want to ask you something directly. When you made this decision in 2019, did you consider telling me what you were seeing?" Preston thought about that. He said, "Yes, I considered it." Lyndon said, "And?" Preston said, "Lyndon, when I bought the 8R370 in 2017, did you tell me that within 5 years the diagnostic access for independent mechanics was going to narrow to the point that Clint Barrows would be substantially locked out of the system?" Lyndon was quiet. Preston said, "Did you tell me that the precision agriculture data the machine produced was going to pass through a subscription architecture that would filter what Dr. Marsh could see?" Lyndon said, "We didn't know the full implementation timeline in 2017. Preston said, "But you knew the direction." Lyndon looked at the table. He was a man who had been in the equipment business for 21 years and had dealt with difficult conversations and had learned to manage them professionally. This was a different kind of difficult. This was the kind where the professional management of it would make it worse. He said, "We knew the direction." Preston said, "Then we both had information we didn't share. You didn't tell me what was coming when you sold me the machine. I didn't tell you what I'd found out when I decided to leave. I'm not certain either of us was wrong to hold what we held when we held it. But you asked me directly why I didn't come to you first, and the honest answer is that by the time I'd read the investor document and run the legal pad, I had already lost confidence in the direction the company was going. Not in you, in the direction. And a conversation with you wasn't going to change the direction." Lyndon looked at the investor document on the table. He said, "No, it wouldn't have." Preston said, "What would you have done with it in 2019? If I'd come to you with this document and the legal pad and said, 'Lyndon, I'm thinking about switching because of what's on these pages,' what would you have done?" Lyndon thought about that honestly. He said, "I would have told you that the platform transition was a John Deere corporate decision and that I didn't have visibility into the implementation timeline and that my dealership service quality was going to remain the same regardless of the software changes." Preston said, "Which is true." Lyndon said, "Which is true." Preston said, "And none of it would have changed what the legal pad said." Lyndon looked at the legal pad for a long moment. Then he looked at the yield comparison. Then he looked at the service invoices. He was a businessman. He had been reading financial documents for 21 years. He could see what the documents said when they were laid side by side on a table with nothing else on them except 2 cups of coffee and the specific honesty of a conversation that had been waiting 2.5 years to happen. He said, "You lost confidence in the direction." "Not in me." Preston said, "Not in you." Lyndon said, "But I lost 5 accounts." Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching this video from. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next video. Preston said, "You lost 5 neighbors who read the same documents I read and arrived at the same place I arrived." Lyndon said, "Because you showed them." Preston said, "Because they asked me." There's a difference, Lyndon. I didn't go to Dale Ostrander's farm and knock on his door and tell him to read these documents. He asked me why I switched. I showed him why. Lyndon said, "And the others?" Preston said, "They asked. I showed them." Carol said, "They asked because Preston is the kind of farmer people in this county ask when they want an honest answer. That's not something Lyndon Hargrove created, and it's not something John Deere can undo." Lyndon looked at Carol. He said, "I know that." A quiet settled on the kitchen. The March morning was outside the window. Preston's field was visible from where they sat, the Case IH Magnum parked at the shed edge, red against the brown of the Iowa ground. Lyndon said, "What do you want me to do with this conversation?" Preston said, "What do you mean?" "If you like the video, please subscribe to our channel." Lyndon said, "You've laid out what happened in a way that's completely clear and completely fair. And I'm sitting at your kitchen table 4 hours from my dealership because 5 accounts I've lost are connected to this farm, and if I don't understand why, I'm going to lose more. So I'm asking you directly, if you were me, what would you do?" Preston looked at him. He picked up the investor document. He said, "Lyndon, this document is publicly available. It's on John Deere's investor relations website. Any farmer in your territory can download it tonight. Most of them won't. But the ones who do, and who build the legal pad around what it says, are going to arrive at the same place I arrived. And the question is whether they arrive there with a dealer who has already read the document and is prepared to have an honest conversation about it, or a dealer who is still going to tell them that the platform transition is a corporate decision he doesn't have visibility into. Lyndon said, "You're saying I should know what my customers know." Preston said, "I'm saying your customers who run careful operations are going to know it eventually. Whether you know it first is your decision." Lyndon picked up the investor document. He read page 17 again. He read page 23 again. He said, "Can I keep this?" Carol went to the printer in Preston's office and came back with a clean copy. Lyndon took it. He folded it and put it in his jacket pocket. He stood up and shook Preston's hand. He shook Carol's hand. At the door he stopped. He said, "Preston, I want to ask one more thing." Preston said, "Go ahead." Lyndon said, "The 5 farmers who switched, is that where it stops?" Preston looked at him steadily. He said, "Lyndon, I haven't asked anyone to switch. I haven't raised it with anyone who didn't ask me first. Whether it stops with 5 is not something I control. What I control is what I tell the next person who asks me directly, and what I'll tell them is the same thing I told the last 5 and the same thing I've told you this morning. It's all on the legal pad." Lyndon nodded. He walked to his vehicle in the March morning. He sat in the vehicle for a moment before he backed out of the driveway and turned onto the county road. Preston watched from the kitchen window until the vehicle was out of sight. Then he turned back to the folder on the table and put the documents back in the order he kept them. The investor document on top, the legal pad beneath it, the yield comparisons, the service invoices, the academic paper. He closed the folder. He said to Carol, "He's going to read it." Carol said, "I know." Preston said, "He might get ahead of it." Carol said, "He might." Preston said, "That would be the right thing for the farmers in his territory." Carol said, "Yes." Preston picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the equipment shed. He said, "Tyler's got the east field scheduled for Monday." Carol said, "I know." Preston put his jacket on and went out to the shed. He checked the Magnum's pre-operation points the way he checked every machine every morning, the way his father had checked machines and his father's father before that, with the specific attentiveness of a man who understands that what you are careful with today is what works when you need it to work. He started the engine. The Case IH came to life in the equipment shed the way it always did, without ceremony, without drama, with the steady competence of a machine that has been maintained correctly and is running in the conditions it was designed for. Preston drove it out into the March morning. The Iowa ground was still cold and bare. 3 weeks until planting. He had preparation work to do. The decision he had made in the winter of 2019 had been 3 seasons old when Lyndon Hargrove drove 4 hours to his kitchen table. It had produced 7 bushels per acre of improvement and 5 conversations with neighbors who had asked the right question and received the honest answer and run their own accounting. Preston had not predicted any of that when he read page 17 of the investor document. He had only predicted the legal pad, the numbers that said what they said when you ran them all the way to the end without stopping at the place where they got uncomfortable. The field was the same field. The soil was the same soil. The corn would grow the same way it had always grown, as long as someone paid it the right kind of attention. Preston drove the Magnum to the east field and went to work. That is the whole story.